Ministers in a mess on migration again. The Prime Minister's authority is at stake. Has Rishi Sunak still got the keys? He didn't look totally in charge at number 10, not just because he and the Dutch Prime Minister couldn't get in for a moment.
We will get flights off the ground, we will deter illegal migrants from coming here, and we will finally stop the boats.
The government announced its new laws to get planes with migrants in the air to Rwanda, but foes found them wanting.
The Conservative Party faces electoral oblivion in a matter of months if we introduce yet another bill destined to fail.
Even Friends convinced the plans fall short. The minister in charge of immigration quitting.
I think the calls...
Where's Robert? He was gone.
They can't hold their party together. They do not deserve to run the country. Britain deserves better than this.
Boris Johnson being quizzed on COVID wasn't the worst thing to happen to the Tories this week.
And nothing but the truth. The dramatic representations that we're now having of this are absolutely absurd.
Rishi Sunak's plan to stop the boats is in trouble. The sides of his party pulling apart. So our big question this morning, forget the boats for a sec. Can the Prime Minister stop the chaos? Well, the man who caused some of it by quitting over the migration plans, Robert Jenrick, is here for his first interview since resigning. How will those in government answer his charges? Michael Gove, the Housing Secretary, is with us too. Looking on for Labour, promising it's ready to serve Liz Kendall, who looks after the party's plans for work and pensions. And war rages on, not just in the Middle East, but on the edge of our continent. We've been back to Ukraine to speak to the First Lady, Olena Zelenska. Is Western backing for the country on the wane?
We cannot get tired of the situation, because otherwise we will die. And if the world gets tired, they will simply let us die.
Morning. To dissect and debate all of that, Bill Browder, one of Vladimir Putin's longtime critics, is with us. Scoop getter Pippa Crerar, The Guardian's political editor, and Damien Green, the former Deputy Prime Minister under Theresa May. Now, we have this morning, just at the beginning of the programme, Robert Jenrick and Michael Gove both in the studio. As you're there, I can't resist asking, Robert, have you two had a chat since you quit? And Michael, you know a thing or two about surprising your colleagues. Have you got any tips for him now?
Well, Robert and I have just been discussing the new National Planning Policy Framework that we're publishing this week, which will ensure we have more of the right homes in the right places.
I'm sure that's all that's on your mind as you two sit there. Robert, have you had a chat with your colleagues? What's it been like since you walked out?
Well, it's a new experience for me, but it was a very important point of principle, which I'm sure we're about to discuss.
OK, we'll talk to you in a few minutes. Thank you both for now. Let's bring you what's happening across the news this morning. The Observer says that Labour is toughening up its criticism of Israel over their attacks on Gaza. The Sunday Times says that the pandemic has brought back a social divide in this country like the Victorian era. And the Sunday Telegraph, on that story about migration, says a group of Conservative lawyers believe that Rishi Sunak's Rwanda plans are not fit for purpose. But the Prime Minister has told the Sunday Express if Labour votes against the Rwanda proposals, they are not serious about stopping the boats. Last, the Sunday Mirror reports on TV stars Helen Flanagan's love life, the latest on that. But they're urging Rishi Sunak to tell the truth at the COVID inquiry tomorrow. So lots of news around and lots to talk about with our panel. Welcome to all of you. Pippa, you've been watching Tory turmoil for many years. How bad are things right now, do you think?
I think this is probably one of Rishi Sunak's worst weeks, if not the worst week. First of all, he loses his immigration minister, Robert Jenrick. Then the public is reminded of the Partygate scandal and of the COVID, the difficulties we all went through during COVID by Boris Johnson's appearance at the COVID inquiry. Of course, Rishi Sunak has his own appearance there on Monday as well, so is that to look forward to too. And then finally, he has on Tuesday coming up this battle within his party to get emergency legislation through the Commons. His party is split. He has the spectre of Theresa May failing to get her flagship legislation through, which ultimately brought about her downfall, to haunting him. And I think he and the people around him will be very much hoping that there's not a repeat of that.
One of the people they're worried about is you, Damien Green. You're the head of the One Nation group. You see yourselves as the moderates in the party. Why are you not sure that Rishi Sunak's doing the right thing on migration?
Well, we insist that one of the basic tenets of conservatism that all Conservative governments should stick to is the rule of law and meeting our international obligations. And so what we're spending this weekend reassuring ourselves, if we can, is that the legislation proposed actually stays within the law.
And as things stand, you're really not convinced the Prime Minister's plan follows the rule of law?
Well, we're going to meet tomorrow, so we're going to take the decision then. He has said, and he's been quite candid about this in public, saying that it gets to within an inch of doing things that we might well find completely unacceptable, and we want that to be true.
Well, the stakes
and
are very
we're
high.
checking it.
Stakes are very high. Stakes are also extremely high, Bill, in Ukraine. Now, we've been back to Kyiv, and we'll hear our interview with Olena Zelenska later. But briefly, if you can, how serious do you think things are in Kyiv at the moment?
Basically, they're within weeks of running out of ammunition. The Russians, as you saw, Putin with Kim Jong-un, getting a whole bunch of North Korean ammunition. The Russians have soldiers, they have bombs, they have bullets, and the Ukrainians are running out. And all this progress that we've seen of Ukraine pushing back will be for naught if we don't refresh our military aid. And that looks like it's running out.
And that's tangled up on Capitol Hill in Washington at the moment. Well, we'll talk more about that later in the programme. But let's start then by hearing from the man at the centre of the tangle in the Tory party. Robert Jenrick, friend and ally of Rishi Sunak, was in charge of the government's immigration plans, but he suddenly quit on the very day the Prime Minister published his new proposals, judging that they were simply not up to snuff. In his Dear Rishi letter, he said that the proposal was a triumph of hope over experience. And he went on to say that stronger protections in the law were required to end the merry-go-round of legal challenges, which could paralyse the asylum system. Well, Robert Jenrick joins us this morning for his first interview. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us this morning.
Good morning, Laura.
Why did you quit?
Well, in government, if you have profound disagreements with the direction of policy, particularly those that you are personally leading, it's right that you step away. And on both illegal and illegal migration, I felt that we were not heading in the right direction. I couldn't be the minister who was guiding this critical bill through Parliament, recommending it to parliamentarians and to the public, if I felt, as I do, that it is a weak bill that won't work.
The Prime Minister, though, said that your resignation was based on what he described as a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Now, do you not understand the plans for Rwanda, or does the Prime Minister not understand the plans for Rwanda?
Well, look, I've immersed myself in this issue more than anyone else in government. In fact, the Prime Minister said just the other day that I was probably the minister who knows more about this topic of any that he's met in Europe. So I think I do understand this issue.
He doesn't. He's wrong to say.
Well, I respect the Prime Minister, of course I do, and our disagreement is on this issue, but it is an absolutely totemic one to the future of the Conservative Party and to the public. And I don't believe this bill will work. I think it will lead to a range of legal claims which will bog down our scheme and will not create the deterrent that he and I set out to achieve. And the test for this is not, can you get one or two symbolic flights off before the next election with a handful of illegal migrants on them? It's, can you create a strong deterrent that is sustainable and stops the boats and protects the borders of this country for years to come? That's what I want to achieve, and I'm afraid this bill is not it.
And you will not vote for it on Tuesday, therefore?
No, I won't be supporting this bill, but I do think we can fix this, and that's what I want to do now. I care about this policy because I care about border security, and I'm determined that we can persuade the government and colleagues in Parliament that there is a better way.
What's absolutely at the core of this is what you've hinted there, and without getting into a big legal tangle, but to explain to viewers, at the heart of this is whether or not migrants would have the right to challenge being sent to Rwanda in the courts. Now, it is your belief, as you've made clear, that there would be lots of appeals which could then gum up the system. What chances did the government's legal advice give the system of working?
Well, it's not right for me to speak about private legal advice. There's a clear convention of that. But you've seen reporting in the press which suggests that the government's own view is that it has a relatively low likelihood of success.
So why is Rishi Sunak then saying that it doesn't? Is he misleading people?
What matters here is a bill that works. And I said very directly to the Prime Minister that if he and I are going to persuade colleagues in Parliament, and above all the public, because this is about the public, that this scheme actually works, we have to be absolutely certain that it's going to succeed. Remember, Laura, we've already done 2 bills. This is the 3rd bill. It's 3 strikes or you're out. I want this bill to work and create that powerful deterrent. And I'm afraid it's very clear to all those people who really understand how this system operates that this bill will not succeed. As you just alluded to, what will happen is that absolutely everyone who comes across on a small boat will put in a claim that Rwanda might be generally safe, but for individual reasons it's not safe for them. And that will have a number of practical implications.
There's a very important thing, though, that you've just said. You've just said anyone who understands this knows that it won't really work. And yet the Prime Minister, your friend and ally, stood at a lectern in Downing Street this week, quite angrily, saying it will work. There is only a vanishingly narrow chance of there being a small number of appeals. So the implication of what you've said is either that Rishi Sunak doesn't understand these proposals, or he's somehow massaging his message to the public to pretend that this bill will do more than you believe it can.
Well, we respectfully disagree on this one issue. I think that a political choice has been made to bring forward a bill which doesn't do the job. And I think that at this moment, when you've got a small boats crisis where 114,000 people have crossed the channel on dangerous, unnecessary, illegal small boats, that we cannot take that risk. The stakes, as you said in your introduction, are simply too high. And the public will not forgive us
to do something that
if we get this
they know
wrong
might
again.
not work. Do you believe the UK has to leave the European Convention on Human Rights to make this work?
No, I don't.
You don't.
I do think that there is a very strong argument for leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, but that is a debate for another day. There are respectable legal arguments for doing all the things that I'm proposing whilst remaining consistent with our international law obligations.
So you do believe the bill can be toughened up?
I would say that even if that were not the case, I will always put the vital national interests of this country and the views and concerns of the British public above contested notions of international law. We're sent to Parliament to represent those people, the general public. We're not sent to Parliament to be concerned about our reputations on the gilded international circuit. It is absolutely critical we fix this problem because in my job, day in, day out, I have seen the untold damage that these small boat arrivals are doing to our country, the community cohesion issues that we're seeing, the billions of pounds that are being wasted on hotels, money that could be spent on better things for the British public, or making a bigger contribution internationally to supporting those who are genuinely in danger. Lives are being lost in the Channel, and evil people smuggling gangs are feasting on the industry that's being created. We have to stop this once and for all, and if you share my determination to do that, bring forward the toughest possible legislation.
Except the Rwanda policy as designed is only at the beginning going to deal with a couple of hundred people a year.
Well, the scheme is uncapped and it has potential to go much higher than that.
Deal with a couple of hundred people a year. So why is it the answer?
Well, look, I've never said it's the only part of our solution. I've worked immensely hard over the last year, and the work that we've done, in fact, the Prime Minister and I have done together, has led to a more than 30% reduction in the numbers coming across, and that's with our negotiations with Albania, the work we're doing with France, the tougher law enforcement approach. However, the key insight that I've learned over the course of the last year is that we will not stop the boats in their entirety unless you interject the strongest possible deterrent, and that is what the Rwanda policy delivers.
I want to talk about legal migration, but do you think planes will ever get off the ground and go to Rwanda?
I do, and I think it's absolutely critical that they do, but I don't think that they will get up and running under this bill, and we will certainly not deliver the serious deterrent, the sustainable deterrent that I'm looking for, unless we change this bill. And I hope that the Prime Minister and the government will listen.
Let's talk about legal migration. As we know, we've talked about in this studio, record numbers of people have been coming to this country, for good or for ill. There have been some changes that the Prime Minister announced this week. Do you think those changes would have come about if you hadn't been pushing behind the scenes?
Well, I don't know. What I do know is that each and every Conservative MP was elected in 2019 on a manifesto commitment to bring down net migration, and it is critical that we do that now. Leaving the European Union was the great reform. It gave us control of the levers of migration for the first time. And the argument that I've been making in office for the last year has been, we have the levers, use them. And it's so important that we do that, not just because of a matter of fundamental trust in democracy, because our fellow citizens have been voting for 30 years for lower levels of migration, and successive governments of all stripes have failed to do that.
And you have been part of those governments. You've been a minister until this week for a very long time. When did you suddenly wake up and be zealous about the need for action on this?
Oh, I've always cared about this. You've seen that, for example, in my record as Housing Secretary, where I was deeply concerned about the housing crisis that is being exacerbated by very high levels of net migration. You saw that when I was Community Secretary, where I worked very hard on community cohesion and integration. And I'm very worried that 1 million new people coming into our country every year is damaging our ability to integrate those people successfully and to be a united country.
Because it's easy to say that to grab headlines, and some people find that very provocative. What's your evidence that integration isn't working?
Well, I think there are communities in our country where people are leading parallel lives, and just it is inevitable. You know, it's an obvious observation that 1 million people coming into our country every year is immensely challenging to successfully integrate. And I'm afraid you see that. I mean, I've seen that recently, for example, with the marches through London, where I saw some people who simply did not share British values. I thought that was wrong, it was deeply disturbing, and I think we've got to take action to address that.
Of migration?
I think it's connected to mass uncontrolled migration, and I think we have to change that.
Some people in your own party, and maybe some viewers watching this morning, think that this is partly at least about something different, that the Tory party's in deep trouble. It's been a shambolic period of time, and actually this is also about your own ambition for the future. If this all collapses into a contest, would you rule out running for the leadership?
I'm not interested in that. I'm solely interested in this policy. I want the Conservative Party to win the next general election. I want it to make good on its manifesto commitments. I think there's a way to do that. We will be in an immeasurably stronger position at the next general election if we've kept our faith with the British public, we've stopped the boats, and we're meeting our manifesto commitment on net migration.
And if you are not, you've written this week the electoral fortunes of the Tory party at stake. If Rishi Sunak cannot get these plans through Parliament, he cannot toughen them up as you wish, you cannot start to see numbers coming down and stop the boats, do the Tories have a chance of winning the election when you are this divided?
Well, I've been very clear that the fortunes of the party hinge, in good measure, on sorting out this issue. And we're not unique in that. Centre-right parties across Europe are facing the same question. If we do not fix this challenge, if we do not meet the public's determination to tackle the issue of illegal and legal migration, then we will face the red-hot fury of the public. And I want to see the Conservative Party meet this moment and tackle a generational challenge.
OK, Robert Jenrick, thank you very much for coming in and giving us your first interview since resigning. Thanks very much. Great to have you in the studio. Now, that was the man who was in charge of Rishi Sunak's proposals for getting migrants on planes to Rwanda. He very clearly, as we've just heard, does not believe that they are going to work, even though Rishi Sunak, rather tetchily perhaps, defended them at a press conference a few days ago.
My patience with this has worn thin. One of my 5 priorities.
Well, if someone who was a member of the government until a few days ago is so clear that the plans are wrong and have failed for years on a subject so close to many voters' hearts, where does that leave the Conservatives? Michael Gove, the Housing Secretary, is with us this morning. Welcome to the studio. We've just heard Robert Jenrick tell us that your party's electoral fortunes depend on sorting this out. Is he right?
Well, I'm not interested in electoral fortunes. I'm interested in doing what is in the national interest. And the bill that is being brought forward is a robust bill, which is legally sound, that will deal effectively with the situation that we face. As Robert mentioned earlier, we've taken steps both to deal with legal migration and also with illegal migration. We've already managed to reduce the number of people coming here illegally. This legislation will ensure that the Rwanda scheme works. And the most important thing, I think, is not the political consideration, it's the real challenge, which Robert rightly addresses, of making sure that the public in this country believe that our borders are secure and the migration system works.
But promising people a bill that would work and would make a difference, that then does not, can be corrosive to what people believe and how people feel about promises that have been made by the government. And I want to put you some of the things he said. He said the bill is weak. He said anyone who understands all of this properly knows that it will not really work. What do you say to that?
Well, I have paid close attention to the words of lawyers like Jonathan Sumption and indeed David Wolfson. Significant figures, Jonathan Sumption, a former Supreme Court Justice. He's very clear that this bill is strong and robust, and Jonathan Sumption is also clear that the Supreme Court, having said that our previous attempts to deport people to Rwanda was unlawful, it's important because people need to know the legal basis on which we're proceeding. Jonathan Sumption...
But the point here, Michael Gove, is that Robert Jenrick and some other lawyers very clearly think it will not function as you hope. Some other lawyers do believe that it will be strong, except the Prime Minister has solemnly promised the country that there is no question that it will work, that there's only a vanishingly narrow chance that people will be able to claim things in the courts and hold it up. And there's legal dispute about this. How can he make that promise when the minister who was in charge of the plans is absolutely convinced that that's not true?
Because we can all see what's in the bill. And we can see that it very clearly points out that the only way in which an individual can challenge deportation is if there is an immediate risk of serious and irreversible harm if they were to be deported. And Jonathan Sumption makes it clear this is such a narrow exemption, and it has absolutely nothing to do with Rwanda itself. Rwanda is clearly a safe country. The legislation makes sure that people can be deported, and it deals with many of the cases and many of the reasons which were used beforehand.
But
it strikes out human rights legislation in a way that some people I know find strong meat, and it's because the reaction from those who are critical of the bill on one side is so clear that I think that we can take it that this bill is certainly the robust measure required.
Robert Jenrick believes, however, he said to us this morning, everyone could theoretically make a claim. The system would be gummed up. The point for our viewers this morning...
Well, that's not correct.
The point for our viewers this morning is that lawyers do not yet agree whether this bill will really, really work. And yet the Prime Minister is making solemn promises to the public that it will make a real difference. And the man who was in charge of this until just a few days ago is convinced that it is not enough.
Well,
this is a shambles on a policy that Rishi Sunak has absolutely wrapped around himself.
I think the critical thing is to look at the legislation itself. And again, the legislation makes crystal clear the basis on which people can be deported. And I think that most people looking at the bill and recognising that it means that you cannot use existing human rights legislation. You cannot use any of the provisions that were cited in the past, will be able to see that this is precisely the measure required in order to deal with the situation. Now, of course, there are some lawyers who disagree. Lawyers are, by their very nature, disputatious. But the black and white letter of this legislation makes it clear that the number of individual cases that can be cited is very small.
Well,
and also, it makes it clear that ministers will make a decision about whether or not someone should be deported on the basis of administrative law.
What will that number be then?
The number who will be sent to Rwanda.
Who will be able to appeal? Or what proportion of people might be able to?
Vanishingly small. And indeed, we have already seen. Thanks to Robert's work, and I must pay tribute to him, we managed to secure an agreement with Albania, which is similar, though not identical.
Which we're not discussing this morning. What proportion of people do you think may still make asylum claims?
The Albania provision has ensured that 90% of people who've arrived here from Albania can be returned. And the reason why Albania is relevant is, again, we've said Albania is a safe country. it is. So my confident expectation would be that the overwhelming majority of people who we choose to send to Rwanda will be sent to Rwanda. But more than that, you don't need to take my word for it. You merely need to see what Lord Sumption and a variety of other lawyers from Doughty Street Chambers, from Cambridge University, and others have said.
So you've said the overwhelming majority. That's your definition of what you hope will happen. And
what I know will happen.
What you know will happen. Well, we'll see what happens in the courts if indeed this gets through Parliament.
Yes.
Because there's a question about whether it'll get through the Commons, let alone then the House of Lords. But you could publish the government's legal advice, put it out there, then everybody could make their own judgment. Why not do that?
Because governments never publish their legal advice, but there is a plethora...
Sometimes they're dragged into it. Over Brexit, Theresa May's government was.
No. There is a plethora of legal opinion out there from people of significant weight, but more than that, I would want to see what the case against the legislation was. And it seems to me that people are saying, you know, some of these individuals will use some of the excuses or justifications that they have used in the past. But the bill explicitly ousts them. And it is very clear that all of the justifications that have been used will no longer apply. So it is only, and it is a very high legal bar, the immediate risk of serious and irreversible harm relating to the individual characteristics of one person.
And
it
you have
is
made
important.
That point, and our viewers have heard very clearly that the man who designed that legislation, or was part of designing it, thinks it doesn't go far enough. I'd like, though, to ask you the wider question. Robert Jenrick believes, essentially, as we've heard very clearly, that for years your party has failed to grapple with illegal migration and legal migration. Do you think immigration of more than 600,000 people coming to this country a year is what Leave voters in the Brexit campaign, who you promised control over immigration, were expecting? Have you let them down?
It is only because we're outside the European Union that we can take the steps that we are taking now to deal with...
up.
Your question was longer than my answer, Laura. So you raise an important issue, which is when we left the European Union, did we take back control? Yes. We can now take steps to reduce those numbers that we were not able to take before. But more than that, you also asked the question, is it acceptable to have those numbers? And I don't believe it is, which is why earlier this week the Home Secretary introduced measures in order to ensure that we could reduce the number of people coming here through legal routes, tighten the rules over visas for people coming here to work, reduce the number of dependents of those who are coming here to work, and also why we're introducing the Rwanda legislation, which has an effective deterrent against the people smuggling gangs who take people here illegally. And on top of that, we have also seen, thanks to Robert, and again I want to thank him for his service, a reduction in the number of people coming here over the English Channel.
But if it's all going so well, and
I wouldn't say it was going well, but I would say
boasting about what you're doing.
I would not boast.
I
think it is important that people see the context.
What is going on here, though? Because we've had resignations, the Tory splits are there for all to see, factions all over the place. Rishi Sunak's unique selling point was meant to be bringing calm back to the Conservative Party. But it's been shambolic, hasn't it, on his flagship policy. If you look at the polls, his poll ratings are sometimes now lower than when Liz Truss was in charge. We all know what views you took of her administration. Would voters be forgiven for just having had enough of all of you fighting with each other?
Well, polls, political commentary, you have a panel who can discuss that. My job as a minister is to deliver policy. And it is to make sure that the legislation and the administrative changes that people want to see are enacted appropriately. So my focus earlier this week was looking at the changes that we were making to the legal migration route in order to make sure that they worked and that they balanced the need to reduce numbers and protect our borders with making sure that we have access to high quality labour in specific areas.
What would you say then to some of your colleagues who are discussing whether or not it's time to think about yet another leadership change, putting in no confidence letters? What would you say to them?
I would say let's focus on the job, which is we were elected in 2019 in order to deliver. We have to ensure not just that we get our migration policy right, but that we also ensure that numbers on waiting lists in the NHS come down. We need to make sure that the economic reforms that we need in order to level up the country are delivered, and that we need, in particular, to ensure that our housing market works effectively for the next generation. So, again, There is an interest in political commentary and speculation, which I completely understand, but my job is to be part of a government determined to deliver.
It is also quite important to our viewers whether or not they have a government that is functioning properly or is very busy fighting amongst itself. But I'm sure that we are very short on time. Before you leave, I'd like to ask you about another news story that has broken this morning. People will remember the story around Baroness Moan, the businesswoman who had PPE contracts with the government. She's admitted for the first time she was involved with the company PPE MedPro that got £200 million worth of contracts during the pandemic. It's said that you were the first person she spoke to about this in government. Do you regret the way it was handled?
I think there are two things. The first is it's important to stress that there is a National Crime Agency investigation. So it's the case that there are a very limited number of things which I can say while this investigation goes on. But I think the other thing that's important to say is that ministers did not take individual decisions about who should receive contracts during the pandemic. Those decisions were taken after a painstaking process by teams of civil servants who assessed the worthiness of any contract that was put forward. So the suggestion, which some have put forward, that somehow ministers were seeking deliberately to do favours or line the pockets of other individuals, I think is totally unjustified, because the decisions were only taken after a proper, coherent and fair procurement process. As with any procurement process, might it sometimes be the case that the goods which have been bought turn out not to be adequate? That is deeply regrettable, but that is a consequence, I'm afraid, of what happened at pressure during a time when everyone in the public realm was doing their very best to try to ensure that we protected those on the front line.
The real scramble at the beginning of the pandemic. OK, Michael Gove, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning, holding the government conch during a very turbulent time. Now, what do you think? Let us know. You can email us, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media minded, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay. Now, Pippa, with your analyst hat on, Michael Gove trying to say, oh, this is all political speculation, I'm not going to get into all this Tory turmoil. What did you think?
Well, it was really fascinating watching Michael Gove and Robert Jenrick sitting there earlier. You can just imagine Michael Gove saying sotto voce, you're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off. I'm not sure if that's a conversation that was had, I should say. But it's really interesting because this is existential for Rishi Sunak. And I'm so surprised that we've reached this point after we're on a third Prime Minister already after the election. And there are Tory MPs that are sitting there quite seriously questioning whether they want Rishi Sunak to take him into the next election. Now, you mustn't overstate that. It's a handful, it's maybe more than a dozen, have suggested, have put their letters of no confidence in. And I think it's unlikely that there will be sort of a marked campaign to get rid of Rishi Sunak in the way that we've seen with some previous Conservative leaders. But there is a danger that there's sort of an accidental leadership bid as a result, as a leadership push, I should say, as a result of this migration policy. And I think anybody sitting on the outside, whether you're viewers at home or journalists or politicians or observers, will be watching this and thinking, why is the Conservative Party blowing itself up yet again?
Damien, then, why are you trying to blow each other up again?
Well, I think we aren't. I agree with Pippa that it's a vanishingly small number. And anyone who thinks that what the Conservative Party or the country needs is a change of Prime Minister is either mad or malicious or both. And it is a very, very small number doing that. I think there are clearly, I mean, as we've heard, this is a difficult issue where ministers are grappling with both legal and political sensitivities. If I can pick up 2 points of what we've just heard. One, it's not true that immigration has gone up inexorably throughout the period. It did come down after we were first elected in 2010. And one of the reasons, and to pick up another point that Robert made, was indeed that we have, over the past year or so, been spending a lot, perhaps wasting a lot of taxpayers' money, putting people up in hotels. The solution to that is to solve the way the asylum system works, just make it more efficient. That's what we did in 2010, and that's what Robert's been doing a lot of work on in the past year or so.
But do you think anybody watching this morning is going to be looking at the conversations you're having as a party about migration and thinking, oh yeah, they know what they're doing? Well,
I mean, it's clearly been a turbulent and difficult period, but we will see over the next few months, assuming this legislation progresses, which we can't assume.
Well, that's my next question then. Which way are you going to vote?
I'm going to decide tomorrow. I'm meeting colleagues in the One Nation caucus tomorrow. We will decide. As I've said already, the Prime Minister says he's sort of within an inch of, as it were, going over the top into something that people would regard as illegal. Indeed, excuse me, the Rwandan government apparently has said, you can't do anything that breaks your international obligations. And we want to test that proposition. And if that proposition is true, then we will welcome it. But that's the proposition we're testing. And if it's not true, we won't. So that's where we are.
Bill, what do you make of all of this? I know you spend a lot of time going around the world looking at what's going on in different countries, but you watch British politics very closely.
Well, I mean, everyone's ignoring the elephant in the room, which is Rwanda. So the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, is like the Putin of Africa. This is a guy, I know this story very, very intimately because the hero of the movie Hotel Rwanda, the guy who saved 1,200 people during the genocide, he was critical of Paul Kagame. He was then kidnapped, brought back to Rwanda and sentenced to 25 years in a trumped-up trial. The idea that we're going to be sending political refugees to a country that's like that is just absurd. The whole thing should be torn up and thrown out. If we want to stop uncontrolled migration, there are other ways, but Rwanda is just completely absurd.
Pippa, how did the Tories get to this point?
Well, I think by making immigration and specifically stop the boats one of Rishi Sunak's key policies that he was going to deliver on before the next election. I think I can understand why. I mean, if you look at the voters that they want to win at the next election, they want to hold on to people who voted, who previously voted Labour, who voted Tory for the first time in 2019, and immigration comes up as one of the top issues for that group of people. But I think it's really important to say across the board that cost of living and state of the NHS, cost of living in particular, are much more important.
So it's cost of living number one, NHS 2. But then immigration,
looking like an obsession with immigration, I think actually turns a lot of people off.
Damien, what do you say to that? Is that a risk?
I think that immigration is an important issue, so I don't think it can be ignored. But I do think there were two big immigration announcements last week on legal immigration and illegal immigration. Illegal immigration, stopping the boats is clearly important, but actually it's about 3% of the numbers coming here. The most important thing the government needs to do is have a clear policy to bring down the overall numbers. And actually, that tough announcement that James Cleverly made last week does go a long way to doing that. And that, I think, is what you need to reassure people, that we're not going to have the societal problems that people like Robert Jenrick have been talking about.
And I want to reassure people we're going to let you have a sip of water rather than coughing yourself through the rest of the programme. Bill, let's talk about Ukraine. We're about to hear from Olena Zelenska. You said at the beginning of the programme that Ukraine is just weeks away from running out of munitions. In your view, what would the consequences be for all of us if Ukraine fails to hold back Russia?
Well, I think everyone needs to understand that Putin's goals are not to stop at Ukraine. If Ukraine runs out of guns, Putin succeeds in the invasion that we thought he was going to succeed in 3 days in. He takes whatever piece of Ukraine, and then perhaps there's like a short-term lull. He rearms, and then the next thing he does is he goes after Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. And these countries are our NATO allies. Mm-hmm. We have a treaty obligation to defend them. And so if he succeeds in Ukraine, then we're faced with an absolutely terrible situation, which is, do we go to war with Russia? Or do we tear up the NATO treaty and let every man for himself in Europe? And in either case, it's a much, much worse situation than to give the Ukrainians what they need to bravely fight off Vladimir Putin and his murderous army.
Well, we will see what happens. Also, the decisions being made in Washington, D.C. about the funding are the critical thing to watch in the next few days. All three of you, thank you very much indeed for now, talking about lots of different things there, including the Rwanda policy. One of the interesting things is the Parliament is declaring Rwanda a safe country, and not everyone in government certainly would challenge your strong comments about President Kagame in Rwanda. Now, you might remember on our very first programme, we spoke to the Ukrainian First Lady, Olena Zelenska. Back then, Western politicians were falling over themselves to swear their devotion to the cause, and billions of dollars, pounds and euros poured forth in defiance of the Kremlin. That doesn't look like that anymore. America's failed to agree on the latest chunk of support, as we've just been talking. Now, we've always promised you we would carry on talking about what's going on in Ukraine on the edge of our continent. So on Friday, I spoke again with Olena Zelenska in Kyiv. just hours after sirens warning of an attack had sounded out over the city.
You know, here in Ukraine, we probably get used to it somehow. When I hear a siren, my first thought, if it is daytime and my child is at school, my first thought is whether they have gone down to the shelter. My second thought is how long the alert is going to last and if I will manage to accomplish everything planned. Work stops for everyone. Air raid alerts are not just about the fear that a missile will hit. The alerts mean that everything stops. Every time it has an effect on the economy, when businesses stop operating and shops close.
You mentioned there, when the sirens go off, you think of your son. Is he at school? Is he going to the shelter? I know you've taken a big interest in what's happening to all children in Ukraine and how they were coping at this time. What is the hardest thing that you've seen and how are you trying to help?
The hardest is that in many cases, childhood is on pause. It is stolen. I mean, only 1/3 of the children can physically attend schools and kindergartens. 1/3 of the children of Ukraine, because there are physically no shelters. That's why now, as a matter of urgency, shelters are being set up and equipped in Ukraine for as many children as possible to be able to go back to what is at least remotely normal life. Recently in Kharkiv, a school was opened under the ground. Surely this is nonsense. A school in the metro. The truth is, Kharkiv is very close to the front line and the Russian border, so missiles reach it very quickly. Meaning not a single school in Kharkiv can afford to host children. They won't make it to the shelter on time. When that project was launched, as far as I know, many teachers, parents, adults in general strongly opposed it. I mean, children have to stay the entire day under the ground without seeing sunlight. Now that the project has already been launched, it saw such huge gratitude from children. When you see how happy the children are to see each other again, to be among friends again, and to study again, it is happiness.
With so many pressures on people here, there is also pressure from abroad. When we spoke last time, we talked about the huge support that Ukraine had had from Western allies. The mood seems to have changed somewhat. In America, Congress is dragging its feet over granting more important dollars for the Ukrainian war effort. If that money doesn't come, what do you fear will happen?
Well, it's a very complicated situation. Yes, really. We do need aid desperately. In simple terms, we cannot get tired of the situation, because otherwise we will die. And if the world gets tired, they will simply let us die. And given what is happening, this danger that the aid will slow down constitutes a mortal danger to us. For this reason, it cannot but scare us, it cannot support us, and we need any kind of support, even moral.
Do you feel, though, that that support has faded? And do you worry that the world is forgetting Ukraine?
Yes, we do worry, but being worried won't change anything. The thing is, our military counts the shells they need. And when they run out, what happens next? I don't want to even imagine that. Today we are sitting in a warm office, thank God, and the airstrike on Kyiv was repulsed, because our air defense forces have enough missiles to take down what flies in. But when they run out, then what? I mean, we count losses every day, and if the help stops, the losses would be impossible to count.
And what would you say then to American politicians right now who are arguing about whether Ukraine should get more money. What would you say also to our viewers who might think, well, it's gone on for a long time, it doesn't look like Ukraine is able to win, maybe there needs to be a different way of trying to work this out?
Мені здається, у нас взагалі в світі велика проблема. Ми звикли до того, що
I think there is a big problem in the world overall. We are used to the world appearing calm. In fact, and that's what we've been saying for the past 2 years now, the aggression that is not stopped spreads like a virus. It starts a chain reaction that does not stop. There are many destructive powers in the world waiting for when they can act. When they see that the reaction of large organizations that should protect peace is weak, and that those organizations merely express their concern that an aggressor is not stopped swiftly, that chain reaction continues.
Що агресора одразу вчасно не зупиняють, ця ланцюгова реакція продовжується.
The mayor of Kyiv recently warned that the president was in danger of becoming an autocrat, that somehow the country was being run on the whims of one man. What do you say to that? It's a serious criticism from a prominent figure.
Я б насправді
I would like to advise to anyone who speaks publicly to think what consequences it's going to have for the morale of the Ukrainians. Everyone should do their own job. The mayor of Kyiv has plenty of duties, and he really needs to pay attention to them. It's very much needed.
Дуже потрібно.
The pressure on you and your husband and your whole family has been so enormous. Has the war changed your husband?
Мені здається, що це можна...
It seems to me you can see it even by his looks. No one is getting any younger. He does get tired. It's physically noticeable. But he has the strength to carry on, luckily. Yes, it's hard for him, like to each of us, but he is in the exact place he needs to be. I'm confident in this.
And just lastly, Christmas is, such a time of joy and hope traditionally. Will you be able to have anything like a normal Zelensky family Christmas this year? Are there any particular traditions that you look forward to?
Я не впевнена, що зможемо...
I'm not sure that we'll be able to do everything we are used to doing at Christmas. One tradition which will definitely be fulfilled is to give gifts to our children. It is a difficult task. I cannot really go anywhere, even to the shops. But fortunately, there are online shops. So to be honest, I spend lots of time now scrolling the feeds, looking for what I can get as gifts. We'll definitely have gifts. But unfortunately, I can't tell you how we are going to give them to each other.
Подаруємо. Я, на жаль, зараз не можу сказати.
Madam First Lady, thank you so much indeed for speaking to us again. It's been such a pleasure.
Дуже дякую.
Thank you very much.
Now, on Tuesday, Keir Starmer hopes to make the most of this moment of Tory chaos and proclaim that Labour is ready to serve. Well, Liz Kendall from his top team joins us in the studio this morning. Welcome to you, Liz.
Thank you.
What does he mean by ready to serve when it comes to migration? So your colleague Darren Jones told us on this programme a few weeks ago you wanted net migration of around 200,000 people a year. Would you believe that the government's proposal to raise the salary threshold of people coming here up to £38,000, is that the right one?
Well, many of the things that the government has put forward on raising the salary threshold, removing the 20% deduction on the shortage occupation list are things we have called for. But look, I have to say I found it quite astonishing on your programme today. We've got 3 different Conservative ministers saying 3 completely different things about the Rwanda bill on illegal migration. And it really does feel like the desperate dying days of this government. And Labour understands that this is a serious issue dealing with the dangerous boats. It's serious for our national security and because of the potential numbers of lives being lost. So we need a proper plan to deal with that. And my concern is that this endless merry-go-round of bills being put forward by the government means we're not going to deal with an issue which is really important for the country and the public feels seriously
And it's a very
about.
important issue, but I'm asking you a specific question. Keir Starmer is saying this week you're ready to serve. So if you would serve, is asking people to have a minimum income of £38,000 to bring family members here, is that the right kind of level?
As I've said, we have called for the salary threshold to be increased. We'd like the Migration Advisory Committee to publish the evidence so that we can see that in detail. But I think the hole at the heart of the migration plans from this government is that they have failed to deal with the skills and training shortages in this country. We need a plan for immigration that works for our economy so we can have a managed and controlled system. And under the Conservatives, I mean, Robert Jenrick was railing about this. Net migration has trebled under this Parliament. But on this and the problem, let me go, because this is the root cause of the issue, is that we need to make sure people in this country have the right skills and training. And the government's proposals are completely lacking in that basic plan to get people in this country the skills and training they need.
But there's an important element of this plan, though, and you have said that Labour agrees that the threshold of income which people need to earn to bring family members here, which is currently £18,000, you say Labour agrees it should go up, is £38,000 the right kind of level? The Archbishop of Canterbury this week told the House of Lords that it will result in people being prevented from living with family members, they'll be separated if they don't have the money. So I'll ask you again, is £38,000 a level that Labour thinks is the right one?
We have called for that to increase. We have said to the government that it's wrong to be able to be paying people 20% less if they're on those shortage occupation lists. But the key thing that we are calling for, Laura, is a real plan to deal with those skills shortages.
But you've said that the salary threshold, increasing that, is part of this plan.
And that what we would like to see...
But you won't give us a level. I just want to be clear about that. So Keir Starmer is going to make a big speech on Tuesday and tell our viewers that Labour is ready to serve. But on this important policy, you're not ready to say what your policy
We are
would
ready
be.
to serve. And our policy for a managed and controlled migration system is based on the key issue here, which is we do not want a migration system that is used as a sort of alternative or to plug the gaps because we are not dealing with the skills and training issues in this country. You will know, Laura, that engineers have been on the shortage occupation list for 10 years, nurses for even longer. The government's only just put construction workers, roof tilers, plasterers on that shortage occupation list.
We're not talking about the list here, we're talking about a specific proposal on salary levels.
And I'm trying to explain Labour's plan on this, which has called for an increase in the salary threshold.
But you won't tell us how high it should go.
What we would like,
you've made that
what we would like to do is see the Migration Advisory Committee set out the evidence and to really work to say you have to have those skills plans in return. And you will know, Laura, I used to work on the issue of social care, where we've seen a huge increase. And what has the government done? Cut the budget for the social care workforce in half. You have got to have a proper plan, and that's what Keir and Yvette Cooper have been proposing.
But viewers will have heard that you are not ready to say at what level those family visas should be set. This is really important to lots of people because it's about whether they can live with their families, elderly relatives, spouses, but you've been clear that you're not going to tell us a figure on that this week. We've heard from Robert Jenrick that migration is far too high. Your leader has said that immigration is shockingly high. Does Labour also agree with Robert Jenrick that levels are so high, integration, bringing people together, is impossible?
No, I don't. I see in my own city, Leicester, very diverse city, that we have for decades worked extremely hard to bring people together and see their common humanity and the contribution people bring and make. But we do want to see those numbers coming down. But let me take a step back here. You know, net migration has trebled under this government on their watch because they haven't put that proper plan in place. And I actually don't take any joy from this chaos that we see. There are serious issues in this country to deal with, not just the issues you're discussing today, But the cost of living, coming up to Christmas, people are desperately worried about how they're going to afford to have Christmas and pay the bills in the new year. The state of the NHS, with 7.8 million people on waiting lists. And the Conservative Party today is ripping itself apart, more about who's going to lead their party in future than who's going to lead the country. And I don't actually take any joy in that. You know, my own constituents are desperately struggling. I've got more than a third of children growing up in poverty in Leicester. And we need a government that is focused on those issues rather than its own future, which is what I'm afraid we've seen laid bare on this show today.
OK, well, Liz Kendall, thank you for coming to join us in the studio this morning. I'm sure you'll be back soon. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today. Well, as Liz was saying, it's no secret that the Tories have got themselves...
I think that a political choice has been made to bring forward a bill which doesn't do the job. And I think that at this moment, when you've got a small boats crisis where 114,000 people have crossed the channel on dangerous, unnecessary, illegal small boats, that we cannot take that risk.
Well, that was Robert Jenrick talking about migration there. We got into a little bit tangled. Our robot cameras seem to have had some minds of their own this morning. But let's have a closing conversation with our panel. It is going to be a busy week. Pippa, what do you think is going to be worse for the Prime Minister, the vote on Tuesday or his appearance at the COVID inquiry tomorrow?
So I think the COVID inquiry, people have made their minds up already in this country. We saw that with Boris Johnson's appearance last week. Clearly, part of that for him was about trying to rewrite history. But I think, as I say, people have made their minds up. However, there'll be difficult questions for Rishi Sunak because he's not come under the microscope, the lens, in quite the same way that Johnson has on this. Questions like, did he get advice on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme? Was he too gung-ho about opening up? One of his senior scientists described him as Dr. Death, the Chancellor. Did he know about parties and toxic atmosphere at number 10? So Monday will be a difficult moment for him at the COVID inquiry. But I think Tuesday, as I said earlier, is existential. It's about holding his party together, and if his party can't stay together over migration, it falls apart and they put themselves in a difficult position going into the next election.
Damien Green, how difficult do you think your party's position is at the moment?
It's been a difficult time. There's no point denying that. But I do think the underlying purpose of stopping the boats, of sorting out legal migration as well, is one important issue. There are other important issues. The economic outlook is improving. We see that Labour they've honed their rhetoric better, but they have no answers. They can't answer any specific questions. So for Keir Starmer to make speeches saying we're ready to govern, they're patently not.
And Bill, watching on, what do you make of the politics in this country?
Well, it's kind of it's a bit of a mess. But let me just point out something you didn't mention on the show, which is that the Foreign Secretary David Cameron made a very, very important announcement, which didn't get a lot of press, which was, as we heard how Ukraine is worried about being cut off. He came up with an idea, which is that we've frozen $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves at the beginning of the war. That money should now be confiscated and given to Ukraine to defend themselves. And that got missed by all the news, but that's one of the great things that this government has done this last week.
And do you think the chances that will happen? I mean, that would be a big chunk of change.
That's real leadership, and something that should have happened a long time ago. And the fact that he stepped in and made it public this last week is something that I can applaud in the midst of all this other nonsense.
OK, well, it's nice to have something to end our programme with, something to applaud. I applaud you three for coming and giving us your insights this morning. Damien, Pippa and Bill, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you, of course, for watching this morning. Ahead of a busy week, as we've heard, the Prime Minister at the COVID inquiry and then the first Commons vote on the Rwanda plans on Tuesday. The divisions and disagreements in the governing party that's been in charge for more than a decade are, once again, absolutely plain for all to see. And I wonder if Rishi Sunak's unique selling point of creating calm seems to have passed its sell-by date for some in his own party. In a few minutes, I'll be joining Paddy O'Connell for this Sunday's newscast. You can catch or subscribe to that later on BBC Sounds. You can watch our programme again on iPlayer if you so desire, or I'll see you next Sunday for our last show of 2023. Can you believe it? It has been quite a year. But until then, I'll see you next week, same time, same place. Goodbye.